The movie kicks off with this big-shot investment company run by a guy named Jeremy. Jeremy's whole deal is shady as heck. He tricks his managers and tells his employees to pull in as many clients as they can. The catch? Once they rake in a ton of money, Jeremy plans to fake a stock market crash. It's all a setup to line his own pockets. One manager tries to push back, worrying about the client's retirement savings, but Jeremy? He couldn't care less. For him, it's all about those fat profits. Jeremy's managers get with the program and tell their employees to go full hustle mode, roping in anyone and everyone to invest. Meanwhile, we meet Jim, an everyday guy who's escorting his wife, Rosie, to her doctor's appointment. Rosie's dealing with a brain tumor situation. Luckily, the doc says the tumor's gone, but she's not out of the woods yet. She needs regular checkups and hormone shots to keep things in check. Rosie's not thrilled, though. She's stressed about how much her illness has cost their family, drowning them in debt over the past 5 years. Jim tries to cheer her up, telling her they'll get through it and that he's working hard to fix their money problems. The next day, Jim's back at his job as a security guard moving cash to central banks in armored trucks. On his break, he vents to his buddy Sean about all the stress he's under. Sean tries to be supportive, saying things will get better. They hang out with two cops, Frank and Freddie, who are also struggling financially. Frank gets all fired up, saying the real crooks are the government officials messing with their pensions and paychecks. Freddie, ever the skeptic, wonders if there are any honest officials left at all. A week passes, and Rosie's back at the doctor for her usual checkup. Jim's footing the bills with his credit card, racking up more debt because his employer won't help with insurance. On top of that, Jim's got money tied up in stocks and, unbeknownst to him, he's been conned. The company he invested in is one of Jeremy's scams. When Jim checks the stock's value and sees it tanking, he freaks out. He rushes to talk to Robert, one of Jeremy's guys who had promised him big returns. Jim demands his money back, but Robert gives him the runaround, saying the stock will bounce back in a few weeks. Jim's not buying it and pushes harder, but Robert dodges him. That night, Jim watches the stocks plummet even more and realizes he's been played. Furious, he tries to contact Robert and threatens to take legal action. The next day, Jim goes to a lawyer named Patterson for help. Patterson seems eager to take on the case, until he finds out Jim doesn't have the money to pay up front. Patterson shows Jim the door, telling him to come back when he can cough up the cash. During lunch with his buddies, Jim spills the beans about needing money to pay Patterson. Frank, Freddie, and Sean all feel for him, but they're struggling too. Eventually, Sean offers to lend Jim his savings. Jim's hesitant, but finally accepts after Sean insists. With Sean's money, Jim pays Patterson, hoping the lawyer can get his cash back. Meanwhile, Rosie's health issues weigh heavily on her, and their financial struggles only add to the tension at home. She starts skipping doctor appointments, knowing they can't afford it. The bills pile up, and one day, Rosie shows Jim a notice saying they're at risk of losing their house. Desperate, Jim tries to get in touch with Patterson again. When he finally gets a response, Patterson tells him the case is a lost cause because the company is protected by law. Rosie overhears this and blames herself for their mess, but Jim does his best to comfort her, even though he's falling apart inside. Things go from bad to worse when Jim gets fired. His boss brings up his mounting debt, saying it could affect his job performance. Feeling wronged, Jim takes his case to the labor department, but they brush him off, saying the official in charge isn't around. The assistant spilled the tea. The official couldn't stand being interrupted, especially by folks struggling financially. Talk about cold. Meanwhile, Rosie was in a really dark place. She couldn't shake the feeling that her illness had been too much of a weight on Jim, so she made a heartbreaking decision. When Jim came home, he found her wedding ring and a note. Panicked, he rushed upstairs, only to discover that Rosie had taken her own life. The loss shattered Jim. At her funeral, he couldn't hold back his grief. It was a turning point for him. Afterward, he hit rock bottom, drowning his sorrows in alcohol day after day. He ignored calls from his 3 friends, Sean, Frank, and Freddie, who were worried sick about him. Jim just couldn't deal with anyone. One night, aimlessly wandering the streets, Jim spotted that Labor Department official living it up at a fancy party with a bunch of rich folks. The audacity! The official eventually stepped outside to take a call, and Jim saw his chance. He confronted the guy, demanding to know why he refused to help people in need. Without hesitation, the official smugly said he didn't care about poor people. Furious, Jim shoved him, and the official stumbled into the street, getting hit by a cab. The news of the official's death spread like wildfire. The authorities chalked it up as an accident, but Jim saw it differently. It was the first step in his personal mission to take down the people ruining the financial system. Fueled by a mix of rage and determination, Jim hit up a newspaper stand the next day, gathering all the intel he could find on the bigwigs behind the corruption. That same day, Jim's troubles piled on. Bank employees showed up at his house to tell him he had 24 hours before they'd repossess it. Left with no choice, he packed his important stuff, including a sniper rifle he'd kept hidden, and moved into a rundown apartment with the last of his money. Eventually, Jim answered a call from Sean and the two cops, Frank and Freddie. They begged him to meet up, but Jim brushed them off, saying he needed time to himself. What they didn't know was that Jim had a plan, a dangerous one. He used what little money he had left to buy weapons and grenades from an illegal arms dealer. Then he found a remote spot to practice shooting, honing his skills for what was coming next. His first target was the vice president of a big-time stock trading firm. Jim waited in a parking lot, and when the guy showed up, he took him out with one clean shot. The media was all over the story, but the police were clueless about who was behind it. Jim had left no trace. Feeling emboldened, he set his sights on his next victim, a finance minister he blamed for policies that caused widespread suffering. Jim watched the minister's home for days, waiting for the perfect moment. When it came, he didn't hesitate. Another shot, another corrupt official gone. By now, the media was in a frenzy, warning financial big shots to watch their backs. But Jim wasn't done. His next target was the head of the country's central banks, a man responsible for policies that had ruined countless lives. Jim struck again, leaving the police and the press scrambling for answers. Jeremy, the CEO of the shady investment firm that had scammed Jim, was starting to sweat. Hearing about the string of murders, he hired a bodyguard to protect him. Meanwhile, Jim decided to meet up with his friends at their usual spot. For the first time in what felt like forever, he smiled at their jokes. When the topic of the recent killings came up, Jim casually admitted he was the one behind them, and even hinted at plans to take out Jeremy and his cronies. His friends laughed it off, thinking he was joking. The next day, Jim went undercover, disguising himself as a janitor at Jeremy's office. He spent days learning the layout, memorizing every detail. One day, while out and about, he bumped into Robert, the guy who had conned him into investing. Robert, shameless as ever, pitched Jim a new investment opportunity and handed him a business card. That night, Jim called Robert, pretending he'd won the lottery and wanted to invest big. Hooked, Robert invited Jim to the office, reminding him to bring the cash. Jim agreed, but he had other plans. He returned to his shooting spot, practicing to make sure his aim was perfect. When the day came, Jim stationed himself in a vacant building across from Jeremy's office. As soon as Robert arrived, Jim took him out. Then, he methodically targeted every employee who had been part of the scam. After ditching his rifle to cover his tracks, Jim entered Jeremy's office wearing a mask. He stormed through the building, eliminating anyone involved in the corruption and setting off grenades to cause chaos. By the time he reached the top floor, only Jeremy and his bodyguard were left. The bodyguard managed to shoot Jim in the hand, but Jim overpowered him. As the police closed in, Jim confronted Jeremy face to face. He removed his mask and demanded to know why Jeremy had no guilt about ruining people's lives. Jeremy, unapologetic, claimed that corruption was the norm and that honesty was practically non-existent in their world. Hearing the cops getting closer, Jim proposed a duel. Whoever grabbed the weapon fastest would survive. Jeremy, true to his nature, cheated, grabbing the gun to shoot Jim. But just then, the police burst in and, seeing Jeremy with the weapon, shot him on the spot. Jim's clever plan worked. The authorities assumed he was just an innocent victim caught in the chaos. His friends, realizing his earlier joke had been the truth, chose to stay quiet. knowing the system would protect the real criminals Jim had taken down. As Jim walked away, battered but alive, he vowed to continue his fight, not just against corrupt financial figures, but against dishonest lawyers, judges, and anyone else exploiting the system for their gain.